Picture a world without lecture halls, without libraries, without any of the formal institutions we associate with higher learning today. Now imagine that world not as an intellectual desert, but as a vibrant landscape where knowledge flowed through personal connections, through letters, through quiet conversations in convents and bustling exchanges in royal courts. This was the reality of the Middle Ages, long before the first universities rose in places like Bologna or Paris. And at the heart of this dynamic intellectual ecosystem were women, brilliant, determined, and largely forgotten women who built intricate knowledge networks that preserved wisdom, sparked innovation, and connected cultures across continents. These women were not just passive recipients of information. They were active creators, curators, and communicators of knowledge, working often in the shadows of history to keep the flame of learning alive during an era when formal education was a rare privilege. Their stories reveal a side of intellectual history that textbooks often overlook, one where collaboration and community were just as important as individual genius. Think about what it means to truly learn, to truly understand something, not just memorize facts for an exam, but to engage deeply with ideas, to question, to create. That's exactly what these women did, despite living in a time when their intellectual ambitions were frequently dismissed or outright suppressed. They found ways to weave knowledge into the fabric of their daily lives, turning convents into centers of scholarship, courts into salons of debate, and households into classrooms. They corresponded with popes and emperors, authored groundbreaking texts on medicine and theology, illuminated manuscripts with stunning artistry, and nurtured the minds of the next generation. Their work was not done for fame or recognition. It was driven by a profound belief in the power of ideas to transform lives and shape societies. And in doing so, they laid the foundational stones for the educational systems we take for granted today. So join us on a journey back through time, to an age of quills and parchment, of quiet devotion and bold curiosity. We'll explore how these remarkable figures built bridges of wisdom across geographical and cultural divides, how they challenged the limitations placed upon them, and how their legacy continues to inspire us to rethink what education can and should be. This is not just a story about the past. It's a reflection on the very nature of knowledge itself, how it is created, shared, and sustained through human connection. By the end of this video, you'll see the Middle Ages in a whole new light, and you'll discover the extraordinary women who helped illuminate one of history's most misunderstood eras. But what exactly were these knowledge networks, and how did they function in a world without formal institutions? Think of them not as physical places, but as living, breathing webs of connection, invisible universities built on trust, curiosity, and the shared desire to understand the world. These networks thrived on the personal exchange of ideas, often carried in letters between scholars, or passed along with a precious manuscript from one monastery to another. They were fueled by patronage, where a wealthy noblewoman might fund the translation of an Arabic medical text, and by practice, where a community of healers would share remedies and techniques. This was a system far more fluid and adaptable than any rigid curriculum. It was about relationships. A recommendation from a trusted abbot could open doors to a vast correspondence. A gifted book could introduce entirely new philosophical concepts to a distant court. This organic structure meant that knowledge wasn't locked away in a single library or lecture hall. It traveled along trade routes with merchants, accompanied diplomats on their missions, and was debated in the quiet scriptoriums of convents. It was a dynamic, ever-evolving conversation that stretched across continents and generations, constantly being enriched by new voices and perspectives. For women who were systematically barred from the male-dominated scholastic world that would later emerge, these relational networks were absolutely vital. They offered a backdoor into the life of the mind. A woman might not be allowed to enroll at a university, but she could certainly commission a book, engage in a theological debate through letters, or lead a community of learning within the walls of her convent. Through these channels, women made significant contributions to fields like medicine, producing texts on women's health that drew from both written tradition and hands-on experience. They advanced theological thought through mystical writings that came from deep personal contemplation, and they contributed to the arts, composing music and creating illuminated manuscripts that conveyed complex ideas through beauty. Understanding these informal networks completely changes our perception of the so-called Dark Ages. It reveals a period not of ignorance, but of intellectual fermentation happening outside the structures we typically look for. Knowledge wasn't yet a commodity to be certified by an institution. It was a shared resource, nurtured and expanded through collaboration. This fluidity allowed for incredible integration of diverse cultures. Ideas from ancient Greek texts, preserved and commented on by Islamic scholars, could find their way into a European convent. Jewish mystical thought could influence Christian philosophy. This cross-pollination was possible precisely because knowledge moved through personal channels, adaptable and open to influence, long before it became standardized and institutionalized. To truly grasp the significance of these women and their networks, we need to step back and picture the world they inhabited. This was a Europe without centralized nations as we know them, a continent knitted together by faith, feudalism, and the slow movement of people and goods. In this world, the very concept of a standardized education system was unimaginable. Learning was not a public institution but a personal pursuit, a privilege that was unevenly distributed and fiercely protected. Your access to knowledge was almost entirely determined by the circumstances of your birth, your social class, your family's wealth, and critically, your gender. For the vast majority of people, education was practical and oral, skills passed down from parent to child within the rhythms of agricultural life or the demands of a trade. Literacy, the key to a different kind of learning, was a rare and powerful tool, concentrated in the hands of the clergy and the elite. Within this fragmented landscape, however, islands of intellectual activity thrived. The most prominent were the monastic schools, attached to monasteries and convents, where the primary mission was the training of new clergy. Here, the trivium grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the quadrivium arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, formed the core of a classical liberal arts education that had been preserved from antiquity. But it was within the walls of convents that women found one of their most stable platforms for intellectual engagement. These religious houses were not just places of seclusion, they were vibrant communities of learning. Nuns learned to read and write Latin, they studied scripture and the church fathers, and they managed scriptoria where sacred and sometimes secular texts were meticulously copied and illuminated. A convent could function as a self-contained knowledge ecosystem with its own library, teachers, and scribes, all operating under the leadership of an educated abbess. Beyond the cloister, royal and noble courts served as another crucial hub. A powerful ruler needed literate administrators to manage their affairs, chaplains for spiritual guidance, and courtiers who could engage in the sophisticated arts of diplomacy and conversation. Noblewomen, often running vast households and estates in their husbands' frequent absences, required a practical education in management, law, and finance. This necessity created an environment where learning was valued. A queen or duchess with intellectual curiosity could transform her court into a salon, attracting poets, translators, and scholars. She could commission the creation of beautiful books, not only as displays of wealth but as repositories of knowledge. In these spaces, the boundaries between the sacred and the secular blurred, as a noblewoman might equally patronize a theologian and a medical writer. And then there was the most intimate classroom of all, the household. For most children, especially girls, formal schooling outside the home was an impossibility. Their first and often only teachers were their mothers or other female relatives. This domestic education was far from simplistic. It included the transmission of cultural values through stories and songs, the teaching of practical medical knowledge like herbal remedies and midwifery, and for the privileged few, instruction in reading using psalters or popular romances. This foundational literacy, imparted at home, was the essential first step that allowed some women to later engage with more complex texts and ideas. It underscores a vital point. The pursuit of knowledge in this period was not separate from daily life. It was woven into its very fabric, from managing a household's health to understanding the liturgical calendar. This decentralized, relationship-driven system had profound implications. It meant that knowledge was not standardized but highly personalized and adaptable. A medical text copied in a German convent might include local folk remedies added in the margins by a knowledgeable nun. A philosophical idea debated in an Italian court could travel northward in the luggage of a visiting diplomat, eventually finding its way into a letter. This fluidity allowed for a remarkable cross-pollination of ideas from different cultures, particularly in regions like Spain or Sicily, where Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars lived in close proximity. The work of translation, often sponsored by female patrons, was a monumental intellectual effort that slowly made Greek philosophy and Arabic science available to a Latin-speaking world. So, while this era lacked the formal credentials and structured curricula that would later define universities, it thrived on a dynamic, organic, and deeply human exchange of wisdom. It was within this rich and complex context that women found their openings to learn, to teach, and to build the networks that would preserve light for centuries to come. Now consider Hildegard of Bingen, a name that echoes through the centuries not merely as a saint or a mystic, but as one of the most formidable intellects of her age. Her story begins not in a university hall, but within the disciplined silence of a Benedictine convent, where she was entrusted to the care of a noblewoman named Jutta at the tender age of 8. This early life behind cloister walls might seem like a limitation, but for Hildegard, it became her greatest advantage. Shielded from the distractions and strictures of the outside world, she had access to something priceless, a library and the uninterrupted time to use it. She immersed herself in the scriptures, the liturgy, and the few classical texts that had been preserved, all while developing a profound inner spiritual life. From a young age, she experienced powerful visions, flashes of light she called the shadow of the living light, which she initially kept private, fearing they were a sign of weakness or even madness. It wasn't until she was in her 40s, after becoming abbess herself, that a divine command finally compelled her to speak and write about what she had seen and understood. This moment of revelation unleashed a torrent of creativity and scholarship that would captivate all of Europe. What makes Hildegard so extraordinary is the sheer range of her genius. She refused to be confined to a single discipline, seeing all knowledge as interconnected, a unified whole reflecting the glory of its divine creator. Her theological masterpiece, Civias or Know the Ways, details her visions in stunning allegorical prose, but it is so much more than a mystical diary. It is a complex work of systematic theology that tackles the nature of the soul, the structure of the universe, and the relationship between God and humanity. Yet at the very same time, she was composing Physica, a comprehensive natural history of plants, animals, and stones, and Corsi et Curie, a practical medical text detailing the causes and treatments of diseases. For Hildegard, there was no contradiction between studying the properties of a gemstone to understand its healing potential and contemplating its symbolic meaning in a vision of heaven. She blended the empirical observation of a scientist with the spiritual insight of a prophet, creating a holistic worldview that modern science is only now beginning to appreciate with its focus on interconnected systems. But writing these revolutionary works would have meant little if they remained locked within her convent. Hildegard's true power lay in her ability to build and leverage a vast communication network, making her one of the best-connected figures of the 12th century. Despite having no official institutional authority as a woman, she commanded the attention of the most powerful men of her era through the sheer force of her intellect and the perceived divine origin of her messages. She engaged in a sprawling correspondence with popes like Eugene III and Anastasius IV, advising them on church reform and even criticizing them when she felt they were failing in their duties. She exchanged letters with the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, warning him about the moral perils of his political decisions. She counseled bishops, answered theological questions from scholars across the continent, and even went on preaching tours, a virtually unheard of activity for a woman, to speak publicly about her revelations. Each letter sent was a thread spun out from her small monastery in the Rhineland, weaving a web of influence that connected her to the intellectual and political nerve centers of medieval Europe. These weren't just friendly notes, they were dense, scholarly missives that circulated among elites, being copied, discussed, and debated, effectively making her works bestsellers long before the printing press. Her role as a network builder extended to the arts as well. She composed an entire corpus of sacred music, including the beautiful Ordo Virtutum, a musical drama about the struggle for the human soul between the virtues and the devil. This music was performed by the nuns in her community, and its unique, soaring melodies were likely inspired by her own visionary experiences. These compositions were another form of knowledge transmission, using beauty and liturgy to convey complex theological ideas to a wider audience in an accessible, emotionally powerful way. Hildegard's legacy shows us that a knowledge network isn't just about exchanging texts. It's about the multi-sensory sharing of ideas through music, art, and personal authority. She stood at the center of this vibrant exchange, a testament to how a woman, operating entirely outside the formal, male-dominated systems of education, could become one of the most influential voices of her time, synthesizing the past and inspiring the future through the web of connections she so masterfully built. While Hildegard was building her vast external network, another brilliant mind was focusing her energies inward, creating a self-contained universe of knowledge within the walls of her own community. Herad of Landsberg, the abbess of Hohenberg Abbey in Alsace, embarked on one of the most ambitious educational projects of the 12th century. Her masterpiece, the Hortus Deliciarum, or Garden of Delights, was not merely a book. It was a complete visual and intellectual curriculum, a summa of all known wisdom designed explicitly for the women under her care. Imagine the scope of this endeavor, a single volume intended to provide a nun with everything she might need to know, from the intricacies of theology to the fundamentals of natural philosophy, all rendered in breathtaking illustrations and accessible Latin verse. This was a university in a book crafted by a woman for women at a time when such a comprehensive educational tool was unheard of. Herod's approach to this monumental task was that of a master curator and synthesizer. The Hortus Deliciarum was a mosaic of knowledge, pulling together fragments from over 50 different sources. She seamlessly wove together passages from the Bible and the Church Fathers with the works of classical poets like Ovid and Virgil, and the latest theological arguments from contemporary scholars like Peter Lombard. This was no simple scrapbook of quotations. It was a carefully structured argument, a guided journey from the creation of the world to the final judgment, designed to lead the reader towards spiritual and intellectual enlightenment. Herod was demonstrating that a deep, scholarly education did not require access to a distant library or a male professor. It could be assembled, organized, and made available right there in the abbey, under the guidance of a knowledgeable female teacher. But the true genius of the Garden of Delights lay in its revolutionary pedagogy. Herod understood that complex ideas are often best grasped through the eyes. The text was accompanied by more than 330 vivid miniatures and full-page illustrations, a staggering number for a medieval manuscript. These weren't just decorative flourishes, they were integral to the learning process. A dense philosophical concept about the nature of the soul could be instantly clarified by a detailed diagram. A parable from Scripture came alive in a colorful narrative scene. For nuns who were still developing their literacy or for whom visual learning was more intuitive, these images were a gateway to understanding. They transformed the act of study from a daunting exercise in decoding text into an engaging, multi-sensory experience. This innovative use of imagery to teach complex subject matter was centuries ahead of its time, prefiguring the modern textbook. The very existence of such a work tells us so much about the intellectual environment Herod fostered at Hohenberg Abbey. This was not a place of passive piety, but an active center of learning buzzing with intellectual activity. We can picture the scriptorium, alive with the quiet scratch of quills and the careful mixing of pigments as teams of nuns worked under Herod's direction to bring this monumental project to life. Some were skilled scribes copying the text with meticulous care. Others were talented artists translating abstract ideas into beautiful, instructive images. The creation of the Hortus Deliciarum was itself a form of collaborative learning, a project that required its makers to deeply understand the material they were illustrating. Every nun involved in its production was receiving an unparalleled education in theology, science, and art. Tragically, the original manuscript of the Hortus Deliciarum was destroyed in a fire during the Siege of Strasbourg in 1870, a catastrophic loss to our cultural heritage. However, its content survives through detailed copies and scholarly reconstructions made in the 19th century, allowing us to still appreciate its grandeur. Herod's legacy is a powerful testament to the fact that women were not just passive recipients of knowledge, but were active, innovative creators of educational systems. She built a complete and structured world of learning for her community, proving that the pursuit of wisdom could flourish within a women-led institution, nurturing a culture of inquiry, creativity, and profound spiritual and intellectual growth that stood as a powerful counterpart to the scholastic world emerging elsewhere. The convent offered a unique and powerful alternative to the limited paths available for women in the secular world. For a noblewoman, it could be a strategic choice to avoid an unwanted marriage or to secure a position of genuine authority and autonomy. For a woman of intellectual ambition, regardless of her birth, it was one of the few places that provided not just permission but a sacred duty to pursue learning. Within the cloister, the traditional societal constraints on female intellect simply did not apply in the same way. An abbess, elected by her sisters, could wield significant power, managing vast estates, presiding over legal matters, and corresponding with bishops and kings as an equal. This authority directly translated into intellectual leadership. She could allocate resources to expand the library, commission precious inks and vellum for the scriptorium, and set the educational tone for the entire community. The convent, therefore, became a space where a woman's mind was not a liability but an asset to be honed for the glory of God and the benefit of her sisters. At the heart of this intellectual engine was the scriptorium. Here, the labor of copying manuscripts was far more than a mechanical task. It was a profound act of scholarship and devotion. Nuns trained in a precise and elegant script would spend hours each day meticulously transcribing texts. This process demanded an intimate engagement with the material. A scribe had to understand the grammar and vocabulary to copy it accurately, and they often became deeply familiar with the content, sometimes even adding their own marginal notes, corrections, or insightful commentary known as glosses. Beyond mere text, many convents specialized in the art of illumination. Skilled artists among the nuns would transform the pages into breathtaking works of art, using vibrant pigments made from crushed minerals and plants to create intricate initials, elaborate borders, and stunning miniature paintings. These illustrations were not merely decorative, they served a critical pedagogical function, visualizing complex theological concepts, depicting scenes from saints' lives, and making the contents of the book accessible to those with varying levels of literacy. Each finished book was a testament to collaborative female labor, blending intellectual rigor with artistic genius. The output of these convent workshops was astonishing. They produced the essential tools of religious life, psalters, prayer books, and copies of the Bible. But their reach extended much further. They copied and preserved the works of classical authors like Cicero and Virgil, medical treatises, historical chronicles, and musical texts. A convent's library could become a significant repository of knowledge, attracting scholars from outside seeking to consult a rare volume. These books did not gather dust on the shelves, they were active tools. In the cloister walks and chapter houses, nuns would gather for readings and disputations, debating theological points or discussing the natural philosophy found in their books. They also composed original works, songs, poetry, devotional texts, and biographies of their foundresses and saintly sisters, creating their own literary and intellectual traditions. Crucially, these convents were not isolated ivory towers. They were dynamic nodes in a sprawling medieval information network. They maintained active correspondence with other religious houses, both male and female, exchanging books, ideas, and news. A noblewoman entering a convent often brought books from her family's library as part of her dowry, introducing new texts to the community. Abbesses with connections to royal courts could acquire the latest translations from Arabic or Greek scholars. Pilgrims and visiting clerics would bring stories and ideas from distant lands. In this way, a convent in Germany could be studying medical knowledge that originated in the Middle East, or an abbey in England could be debating a theological point currently stirring controversy in Paris. The convent walls provided the protective space for deep focus, but they were permeable to the flow of ideas, making these communities integral to the preservation and cross-pollination of knowledge across the medieval world. For countless women across centuries, the rhythmic life of prayer and work within these communities offered a sanctuary for the mind, a rare and precious space where their intellectual curiosity was not just tolerated but celebrated as a form of devotion. While convents provided a structured environment for female learning, the corridors of power in the secular world offered another, equally potent avenue for influence. Noblewomen, wielding immense wealth and political authority, became the unsung engines of intellectual progress, acting as patrons who literally funded the Renaissance of the 12th century. Their role went far beyond simply writing checks. They were active, discerning curators of culture who used their resources to create ecosystems where ideas could flourish. Imagine a powerful duchess managing vast estates and navigating complex political alliances, yet still making time to personally commission the translation of an Arabic astronomical text, or to host gatherings where theologians, poets, and natural philosophers could debate the great questions of the age. This was not a hobby, it was a strategic investment in what we would now call soft power, understanding that a court known for its intellectual vibrancy attracted the best minds, enhanced its prestige, and could even shape the ideological landscape of Europe. Consider the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most famous women of the Middle Ages. As Queen of France and later England, she was at the center of a vast geopolitical network, but her court was also a celebrated cultural salon. She famously patronized the troubadours of southern France, bringing their poetry and songs of courtly love to the north, which profoundly influenced European literature and social customs. This wasn't merely entertainment, it was the dissemination of a complex philosophical and ethical system that explored the nature of desire, loyalty, and the individual's relationship to society. By championing this art form, Eleanor wasn't just a passive consumer, she was actively sponsoring a new way of thinking about human emotions and relationships, ideas that would ripple through literature for centuries. Her patronage provided a stable income and a prestigious platform for artists whose work might otherwise have been lost, ensuring their ideas entered the mainstream of medieval thought. Then there is the less celebrated but equally impactful Matilda of Tuscany. From her powerful stronghold in Canossa, Italy, this Grand Countess was a pivotal figure in the investiture controversy, the great power struggle between the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire. But alongside her military and political maneuvering, Matilda was a dedicated patron of learning. She surrounded herself with some of the leading legal minds of her day, including the famous jurist Emirius, who is often considered the founder of the University of Bologna's law school. Her support for these scholars was crucial in the revival of Roman law, an intellectual movement that would eventually form the bedrock of modern European legal systems. By providing these thinkers with resources, protection, and a stimulating environment, Matilda directly facilitated one of the most significant intellectual recoveries in history. Her patronage demonstrates how noblewomen could influence not just the arts but the very frameworks of governance and justice. The work of these patrons often had a wonderfully practical and multicultural dimension. Many sponsored massive translation projects, particularly in places like Spain and Sicily, where Christian, Jewish, and Muslim cultures intersected. A noblewoman might commission a team of scholars, a Christian to oversee the project, a Jew fluent in Arabic to translate the text into a Romance language, and a scribe to write it down to make Greek philosophy or advanced Islamic medicine accessible to a Latin-speaking audience. This collaborative, cross-cultural effort was the medieval equivalent of a major research grant, and it was often administered by women. Through their efforts, the works of Aristotle, Galen, and Avicenna slowly filtered into European intellectual circles, eventually fueling the scholastic revolution in the universities. Their libraries became repositories of this newly translated knowledge, acting as critical infrastructure for the intellectual community. This model of patronage created a powerful alternative to the institutionalized learning that was still developing. A scholar didn't necessarily need a university appointment if he could gain the support of a discerning patron like Eleanor or Matilda. This system allowed for a greater diversity of thought, as these women often supported controversial figures or unconventional ideas that might have been suppressed in more formal settings. They provided a space for experimentation and dialogue, hosting salons and gatherings that were the forerunners of the 18th century Enlightenment societies. In doing so, these noblewomen did more than just preserve old knowledge. They actively midwifed new ideas into the world, using their unique position at the intersection of power, wealth, and culture to fuel an intellectual exchange that would ultimately lay the groundwork for the modern world. Their legacy is a powerful reminder that the history of ideas is also a history of the resources and spaces that make thinking possible. Yet for every famous abbess or visionary author, there were countless anonymous women whose hands literally shaped the words we remember from this era. Their work was not done on a grand stage, but in the quiet, sunlit scriptoriums of convents or at sturdy tables in noble households, engaged in the painstaking, essential labor of the scribe. This was a world where every book was a unique, handcrafted object, and the act of copying was the only way knowledge could travel or even survive. Without these women, working for hours each day with quill and ink, entire libraries of classical learning, spiritual insight, and practical wisdom would have been lost to time. They were the indispensable infrastructure of the medieval mind, the human printers who ensured ideas could outlive their authors and reach new audiences across generations. The physical process of creating a manuscript was a demanding craft that required immense skill and patience. It began with the preparation of the writing surface parchment, made from the treated skin of sheep or calves. This material was costly and time-consuming to produce, making every sheet precious. The scribe would then carefully rule the page with faint lines to keep her writing straight and even, a task requiring a steady hand and a good eye. Next came the ink, often handmade from gallnuts, iron salts, and gum arabic, mixed to a precise consistency to flow smoothly from the quill without blotching. The scribe's primary tool was her pen, cut from the feather of a goose or swan, its nib shaped and sharpened to a fine point. With this, she would begin the slow, deliberate work of transcription, copying letter by letter from an existing, and often fragile or damaged exemplar. This was far more than simple repetition. It was an act of deep concentration. A single moment of distraction could lead to a skipped word, a misread line, or a messy correction that marred the beauty of the page. The goal was not just accuracy, but also beauty, creating a clear and elegant script that was a pleasure to read and a testament to devotion. For the nuns working in a convent scriptorium, this labor was a form of prayer, a sacred duty known as ora et labora, pray and work. The rhythmic scratching of the quill, the slow progress down the page, the very formation of each sacred word was considered an act of meditation and worship. Their work was primarily focused on religious texts, psalters for the daily divine office, missals for the celebration of Mass, and volumes of scripture and patristic commentary for study. But their intellectual curiosity often spilled beyond strictly devotional material. We find convents copying and preserving classical poetry by Ovid and Virgil, historical chronicles, medical and herbal compendiums, and even legal texts. A great abbey's library was a beacon of learning, and the scribes were the keepers of its flame. Their efforts ensured that the wisdom of the past, both sacred and secular, remained alive and accessible for future scholars. Perhaps the most stunning evidence of their creative contribution lies in the art of illumination. Many of these female scribes were also talented artists, known as illuminators. After the text was copied, they would transform the page into a vibrant visual experience, using pigments painstakingly ground from minerals, plants, and even precious stones. Lapis lazuli for a celestial blue, malachite for a verdant green, gold leaf for a divine radiance. They would bring the words to life. They painted intricate initials that curled into elaborate scenes, decorated margins with whimsical drolleries of animals and figures, and created stunning full-page miniatures that depicted biblical narratives or theological concepts. This was not mere decoration, it was a sophisticated form of visual commentary. An illuminated letter might summarize the entire theme of a chapter, while a marginal scene could offer a witty or critical gloss on the text. Through their art, these women were actively interpreting and enriching the material they copied, adding a layer of their own understanding and creativity to the works they transmitted. Sadly, the vast majority of these scribes and artists remain anonymous to us, their identities subsumed by the collective identity of their religious community or household. They signed their work only rarely, as the concept of individual artistic authorship was not the cultural norm it is today. Yet, a few brave or proud souls did leave their mark, a quiet declaration of their presence across the centuries. In a 12th century German manuscript, a nun named Guda wrote a self-portrait into the letter D of a Latin text, accompanied by the bold words, "Guda, sinner, wrote and painted this book." In another, a woman named Clarissa visibly inserted her own image, swinging playfully from the flourish of a large letter Q, her identity unmistakable. These rare signatures are powerful exceptions that prove the rule, giving us a fleeting glimpse of the individual women behind the vast, anonymous sea of manuscripts. They remind us that each carefully formed letter, each vibrant splash of color, represents the skill, dedication, and often the silent, profound intellect of a woman who chose to spend her life preserving the light of knowledge for the world yet to come. While the convents and courts of Europe were fostering their own vibrant cultures of learning, an equally rich and dynamic intellectual world was flourishing under the caliphates of the Islamic Golden Age and within the scholarly Jewish communities scattered across the diaspora. Here, far from the shadow of emerging European universities, women were also building and sustaining knowledge networks, often navigating different but equally complex social structures to leave their mark. The story of Fatima al-Fihri stands as a monumental example. In the 9th century, this deeply devout and wealthy woman used her entire inheritance to fulfill a visionary dream, founding the Al-Karawiyyin Mosque and Madrasa in Fez, Morocco. This was no simple house of worship. It was designed from its inception as a center for advanced education, a place where the greatest minds could gather to study theology, law, grammar, music, and crucially, the natural sciences. Under her careful patronage and oversight, it grew into one of the first degree-granting institutions in the world, a beacon of learning that attracted scholars from across Africa, the Middle East, and even Europe for centuries. Its library, which she also established, became a legendary repository of precious manuscripts. Fatima's genius lay in her understanding that knowledge required a permanent home, a stable institution that could outlive its founder and serve generations to come. She didn't just participate in a network, she architecturally embodied one, creating a physical crossroads for the exchange of ideas that continues to operate to this day. Beyond such foundational figures, the Islamic world recognized a surprising number of women as respected scholars and authorities in their own right. In the bustling urban centers of Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, it was not unheard of for women to obtain ijazas, formal certifications that granted them the authority to teach and transmit knowledge, particularly in the field of hadith, the recorded sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad. The reliability of these chains of transmission was paramount, and women were often prized for their meticulousness and powerful memories. Scholars like Zainab bint Ahmad, who lived in 12th century Damascus, became renowned for her expertise in hadith and law, teaching large classes of male students who traveled to study with her. Similarly, in the royal courts, women of power acted as crucial patrons. Sayyida al-Hurra, for instance, a 16th century ruler in Morocco, was not only a formidable political and military leader, but also a great patron of the arts and learning, supporting scholars and artists and fostering a culture of intellectual refinement. These women operated within a different framework than their European counterparts, but their impact was no less significant, ensuring that the vast advancements in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy generated during this era were preserved, discussed, and passed on. Within Jewish communities, which often existed as minority cultures within both Christian and Muslim societies, the structure of knowledge transmission looked different yet again. Formal rabbinical scholarship was a male domain, but women found essential roles as enablers and facilitators of this learning. A powerful model is found in the figure of Dulce of Worms, wife of the renowned 12th century rabbi Judah the Pious. While her husband and sons were immersed in study and writing, Dulce managed the family's economic life, running a successful business that provided the financial stability necessary for their scholarly pursuits. Her household in the German city of Worms became a renowned hub of hospitality, a safe haven for traveling scholars and students who came to learn from her husband. She didn't just feed and house them, she actively participated in the intellectual life of the community, likely copying manuscripts and crafting the parchment needed for sacred texts. Her profound contribution was creating the physical and emotional space for learning to thrive, handling the worldly concerns so that the men could focus on the spiritual and intellectual ones. Her life, detailed in a moving elegy written by her husband after her tragic death, illustrates the indispensable, though often behind the scenes, role women played in sustaining the great yeshivas and scholarly traditions of medieval Judaism. In other cases, Jewish women's knowledge was more direct and practical, particularly in the realm of medicine. Many developed expertise as healers and midwives, skills that were passed down through generations of women, and often blended observed folk remedies with written medical knowledge from various traditions. In the multicultural environment of places like medieval Spain, a Jewish woman healer might employ techniques learned from an Arabic medical text alongside herbs recommended in a local Christian tradition. This practical, cross-pollinating knowledge was vital to community health and represented a form of intellectual authority that was widely respected, even if it was rarely recorded in formal texts. The efforts of these women, whether as patrons like Fatima al-Fihri, as scholars like Zainab bint Ahmad, as facilitators like Dulce of Worms, or as healers using blended knowledge, all point to a single, powerful truth. The medieval pursuit of wisdom was a global phenomenon, and its networks woven through mosque schools, bustling markets, and quiet households relied on the intelligence, dedication, and resourcefulness of women who understood that knowledge is the most valuable currency of all. Now, let's travel south to the vibrant, sun-drenched coast of southern Italy, to a place that defied all the norms of medieval medicine. The school of Salerno was unlike any other center of learning in 11th and 12th century Europe. While the emerging universities in the north would soon systematically exclude women, Salerno flourished as a remarkably open and pragmatic medical community. Here, the lines between formal and informal knowledge blurred beautifully. It was a crossroads of cultures where Greek, Latin, Arabic, and Jewish traditions met and mingled, and at this bustling intersection stood a remarkable group of women known as the Muliere Salernitani, the women of Salerno. These were not hidden figures or anonymous scribes. They were celebrated, practicing physicians, surgeons, and instructors whose expertise was sought by the powerful and the poor alike. Their very existence shatters the monolithic image of medieval medicine as an exclusively male priesthood. The secret to Salerno's unique environment was its location. A thriving port city, it was a constant whirl of merchants, pilgrims, crusaders, and scholars moving between Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. This constant flow of people meant a constant flow of ideas. Arabic medical texts, which had preserved and expanded upon the work of Greek masters like Hippocrates and Galen, arrived on its shores. Jewish medical practices, often more advanced in areas like pharmacology, were part of the local fabric, and woven through it all was a deep well of local, southern Italian folk medicine, a practical knowledge of herbs and healing passed down through generations, often by women. The Muley heirs Salernitani were the master synthesizers of this incredible intellectual cocktail. They refused to recognize a hierarchy that placed ancient texts above observed results. To them, a proven remedy from a local midwife was just as valuable as a complex theory from a Baghdad physician. Their genius was in their pragmatism. If it worked for the patient, it was valid medicine. This empirical approach is brilliantly captured in their most famous surviving work, the Trotula texts. This collection of writings on women's medicine, named for a legendary female physician Trota or Trotula, became one of the most influential medical compilations in medieval Europe. It was not a single book by one author, but rather an evolving corpus, likely compiled and edited by several knowledgeable women over time. The Trotula is astonishing in its scope and practicality. It covers everything from conception, pregnancy, and childbirth to cosmetic treatments, with a focus on the health and treatment of women by women. The text doesn't just parrot classical authorities, it questions them. It offers multiple remedies for the same ailment, noting which one is best for a delicate woman and which is more fitting for a peasant woman, showing a nuanced understanding of different patients' lives and constitutions. It includes surgical instructions for repairing perineal tears after childbirth, a procedure that required tremendous skill and confidence. This was not abstract theory, it was a hands-on manual for practice, written with the authority of direct experience. Through works like the Trotula, the women of Salerno did something revolutionary. They built a standardized transnational curriculum for women's health long before any university offered a medical degree. A physician in England or France could now access a consolidated body of knowledge on gynecology and obstetrics that originated from the collective experience of female experts. Their texts traveled along the same routes they did, carried by merchants and scholars, effectively creating a distributed network of medical knowledge that connected practitioners across the continent. They were cited and respected by male authors for centuries, their authority stemming not from an institutional title, but from the demonstrated success of their methods. The legacy of the Muley heirs Salernitani is a powerful testament to the idea that innovation happens at the intersections between cultures, between theory and practice, and between different ways of knowing. They stood as living proof that medicine could be inclusive, collaborative, and deeply effective without conforming to a rigid, male-dominated model. Their story forces us to ask a difficult question. How much knowledge was lost or progress delayed when other centers of learning chose to exclude this kind of practical, cross-cultural wisdom in favor of a more closed and theoretical approach? The School of Salerno, with its brilliant women healers, represents a road not taken in the history of medicine, a vibrant reminder that the best care often comes from the broadest perspective. While the work of healers and scribes was often collaborative and practical, other women were weaving intricate worlds of thought through the written word, building literary networks that connected minds across castles and countries. In an age where a woman's voice was seldom heard in public forums, the page became a powerful stage for intellectual and emotional expression. Take Marie de France, for instance, a mysterious figure writing in the 12th century Anglo-Norman court. We know almost nothing about her life, not even her real name. She is identified only by her self-chosen moniker, Marie de France, a declaration of her cultural identity. Yet through her lies, a series of short narrative poems, she created a lasting legacy. These weren't simple romances, they were sophisticated explorations of chivalric love, magic, and the complexities of human desire, often told from a distinctly female perspective. Her work gives voice to the inner lives of her characters, particularly women, as they navigate the often conflicting demands of love, duty, and societal expectation. By choosing to write in the vernacular French rather than scholarly Latin, Marie made a conscious decision to speak directly to a secular, courtly audience, including the noblewomen who were her primary readers and patrons. Her dedications to a noble king, likely Henry II of England, show her keen awareness of the patronage system, but the substance of her work reveals a mind deeply engaged with the ethical and philosophical questions of her time. A few centuries later, another voice would emerge, one so forceful and clear it would challenge the entire literary establishment of the Middle Ages. Christine de Pizan stands as a breathtakingly modern figure, a professional writer who supported her children and her widowed mother entirely with her pen. Living in the vibrant intellectual court of Charles VI of France, Christine was immersed in the debates of the day, particularly the wildly popular but deeply misogynistic romance of the Rose. Unlike other women who might have quietly disagreed, Christine launched a full-throated public rebuttal, initiating what historians call the Querelle de la Rose, the debate of the Rose. In a series of letters exchanged with powerful male clerics, she systematically dismantled the poem's portrayal of women as deceitful and manipulative, arguing instead for their virtue, intelligence, and essential humanity. This was more than a literary spat. It was a woman entering the most prestigious intellectual debate of her era and holding her own through sheer force of logic and rhetorical skill. Through this very public correspondence, Christine wasn't just expressing a personal opinion. She was building a coalition, demonstrating how literary networks could be used for spirited, scholarly debate that challenged the dominant cultural narrative. Christine's magnum opus, The Book of the City of Ladies, is perhaps the ultimate example of using allegory to build a community of thought. In it, she presents a powerful vision. She is visited by three allegorical figures, reason, rectitude, and justice, who command her to construct a metaphorical city, a fortress populated entirely by heroic and virtuous women from history and myth. As she literally builds this city brick by brick with her words, she populates it with hundreds of examples of female rulers, warriors, inventors, and scholars, creating an entire counter-history to the one written by men. This book was not a solitary lament. It was a foundational text, a gathering place. It was dedicated and circulated among powerful noblewomen, including the Queen of France, creating a shared intellectual space for its readers. A woman reading this book in her chambers was no longer isolated. She was a citizen of this imagined city, connected to a glorious lineage of female achievement and to a network of other contemporary readers who are also engaging with these radical ideas. Christine was actively constructing a community of interpretation, giving her audience a new lens through which to see themselves and their capabilities. The circulation of these works reveals the physical mechanics of these literary networks. A beautifully illuminated manuscript of Christine's work, commissioned by a wealthy duchess, would be a prized possession. It might be read aloud in the court's great hall, its ideas sparking discussion among the listeners. It could then be lent to a visiting noble from another region, who would have a copy made for his own library, thus spreading these ideas to a new court and a new audience. Marginal notes in surviving manuscripts show us that readers were actively engaging with the text, underlining passages that resonated, or adding their own comments in the margins. This was a slow, deliberate form of viral sharing, where each copy represented a new node in an expanding web of influence. Through their poetry, their allegories, and their fierce polemics, women like Marie de France and Christine de Pizan did more than just write books. They built invisible republics of letters, fostering conversations about justice, love, and identity that connected isolated individuals across the map, creating a sense of shared intellectual purpose that transcended the physical and social limitations of their world. Beyond the convent walls and the bustling royal courts, the most fundamental and widespread education unfolded in a far more intimate setting, the heart of the home. For the vast majority of medieval children, the world of ideas did not open in a classroom but by the hearth, with a mother or grandmother as their first and most influential guide. This domestic classroom had no formal curriculum or standardized tests. Its lessons were woven seamlessly into the fabric of daily life, making the home the primary incubator of practical wisdom, moral character, and for a fortunate few, the transformative skill of literacy. The role of these women was monumental, for they were tasked with shaping not just capable individuals, but the very moral and intellectual fiber of the next generation, all within the confines of their own four walls. The curriculum of the household was overwhelmingly practical and essential for survival. From their earliest years, girls learned by doing, shadowing their mothers and female kin in the myriad tasks that kept a family fed, clothed, and healthy. This was a hands-on education in what we might now call domestic science and economics. They learned to spin wool into thread and weave it into cloth, a process that required an understanding of materials, tension, and design. They were taught to manage a kitchen garden, knowing which herbs could season a stew and which could heal a fever, possessing a working knowledge of botany that was passed down through oral tradition. Preserving food for the long winter months through salting, drying, and brewing was a lesson in chemistry and foresight. For boys, the education might be directed toward their father's trade, but the mother's domain was the universal school of home management, a complex role that demanded expertise in medicine, agriculture, textile production, and resource allocation. This knowledge was not theoretical. It was immediately applicable, and a mother's ability to impart it effectively could mean the difference between prosperity and hardship for her children. Yet this education was far more than just vocational training. Intertwined with every practical skill was a powerful thread of moral and ethical instruction. Storytelling was the primary vehicle for this. In the evenings, by the dim light of a rush candle, mothers and grandmothers would become custodians of oral history, recounting tales from the Bible, local legends of saints and their miracles, or chivalric romances that had been passed down for generations. These stories were not mere entertainment. They were a sophisticated tool for teaching community values. The parable of the Good Samaritan taught lessons in charity and compassion, while stories of knightly quests reinforced ideals of courage, loyalty, and honor. Through these narratives, children learned the complex social codes of their world, understanding their place within the family, the community, and the cosmic order of God's creation. A mother, through her stories, became a philosopher and a theologian, simplifying profound concepts into allegories that a young mind could grasp and remember. For a smaller segment of society, particularly among the nobility and the rising urban merchant class, this domestic education also included the revolutionary gift of literacy. A noblewoman, often educated herself in a convent or by a private tutor, would frequently take on the responsibility of teaching her children to read. The primers for these lessons were telling of the goals, A beautifully illuminated psalter provided a text for learning Latin letters while simultaneously immersing the child in the rhythms of prayer. A popular romance, like those of King Arthur, might be used to practice reading the vernacular language, engaging their imagination while building fluency. Some households even possessed practical manuals, like books of hours or treatises on hunting and etiquette, which served as dual-purpose tools for both instruction and socialization into their aristocratic role. The act of a mother pointing to words on a page, sounding them out with her child, was a quiet but profound intellectual transaction. It was the spark that could ignite a lifetime of learning, providing the foundational skill that allowed a daughter to later delve into more complex texts in a convent library, or a son to manage the legal documents of his estate. This role extended beyond direct instruction to that of an educational facilitator. A shrewd and well-connected noblewoman acted as the headmistress of her own domestic academy, curating her children's intellectual environment. She would seek out and hire the best tutors for subjects beyond her own expertise, such as advanced Latin, music, or mathematics. She would carefully select the books that entered her household, building a small but influential library. And perhaps most significantly, she would make the strategic decision to send her daughters to be educated in a nearby convent, a common practice among the aristocracy. This was not a rejection of her own teaching, but an extension of it, an investment in providing her daughter with the finest and most comprehensive education available to women at the time. The mother's early lessons in literacy and devotion at home were the essential preparation that allowed a young girl to thrive in the more rigorous academic atmosphere of the abbey. In this way, the seemingly humble education of the household was never an endpoint. It was the critical foundation, the fertile soil from which all future intellectual and spiritual growth could spring, nurtured by the first and most dedicated teachers these children would ever know. In an age devoid of digital networks or rapid transit, the humble letter became the superhighway of the medieval mind, a tangible thread that could weave together thinkers separated by vast distances and daunting landscapes. For women who are so often physically confined to convents, castles, or their own households, correspondence was nothing short of liberation. It was a way to project their intellect far beyond their immediate surroundings, to engage in the great debates of their time, and to build enduring relationships based on shared curiosity and mutual respect. A well-composed letter was more than just a personal message. It was a scholarly publication, a diplomatic overture, and a personal connection, all rolled into one carefully sealed package. The act of sending a letter required significant investment: the cost of parchment, the time of a trusted messenger, the uncertainty of delivery, which meant that every word was chosen with immense care and purpose, transforming casual exchange into a deliberate act of intellectual curation. Consider the sprawling correspondence of a figure like Hildegard of Bingen. Her letters were not mere pleasantries. They were dense theological treatises, medical consultations, and pointed political advisories, all delivered through the medium of personal address. She wrote to Bernard of Clairvaux, the most famous monk of his era, not to flatter him but to seek his validation for her visions, a strategic move that leveraged his authority to amplify her own voice. She sent detailed medical advice to emperors and popes, her letters acting as long-distance house calls that blended spiritual counsel with practical healing techniques. Each missive she sent out from her Rhineland monastery was like casting a stone into a pond, the ripples of her influence spreading through the copies made by recipients and the discussions they sparked in their own circles. Her correspondence network effectively became a distributed university, with Hildegard as the central, guiding professor. Her curriculum delivered one parchment page at a time. Centuries later, Catherine of Siena would wield the power of the letter with even more direct political force. An uneducated daughter of a dyer with no formal status or institutional power, she used her prolific letter writing to council popes, negotiate peace between warring city-states, and advocate for reform within the church. Her letters are fiery, passionate, and utterly fearless, addressing the most powerful men in Europe with a tone of commanding authority. She didn't just offer suggestions, she issued calls to action, scolding leaders for their failures and exhorting them to fulfill their spiritual and civic duties. Her correspondence was her pulpit, and through it, she preached a revolution of love and justice to the entire continent. The survival of over 400 of her letters offers us a breathtaking map of her influence, a web of connections that stretched from her humble home in Siena to the papal court in Avignon and beyond, proving that a determined woman with a quill could shape the course of history. The content of these letters reveals the breathtaking range of topics women felt empowered to discuss. They were not confined to domestic trivialities. We find letters debating complex points of scripture, analyzing astronomical events, describing the properties of newly encountered plants, and sharing innovative artistic techniques. An abbess might write to a scholar in another country to request a copy of a rare text she had heard about, or to send him a commentary she had written on it. Noblewomen exchanged recipes for inks and pigments along with political gossip, their letters serving as a blend of scientific journal and diplomatic dispatch. The medium's flexibility was its greatest strength. A single letter could contain a personal prayer, a detailed observation of a comet, and a request for a favor, all woven together seamlessly. This integrative approach mirrors the holistic way medieval women engaged with the world, refusing to compartmentalize knowledge into separate boxes. The physical journey of these letters is a story in itself. They traveled along pilgrim routes in the pouches of monks, were carried by merchants along trade networks, or were entrusted to royal messengers on horseback. The delivery of a letter was a moment of high anticipation, often followed by a communal reading and discussion. The recipient might then craft a detailed response, but they were just as likely to make copies of the original letter to share with their own network, amplifying the sender's ideas far beyond the intended audience. Annotations in the margins of surviving letters show us that they were actively studied, with readers underlining key points, adding cross-references to other texts, or jotting down their own reactions. This culture of sharing and commentary transformed private correspondence into a semi-public forum, a slow-motion seminar that could last for months or even years as the dialogue unfolded across the miles. The letter was the durable, flexible, and profoundly human technology that made the medieval republic of letters possible, and women were among its most masterful and prolific architects, writing their way into the intellectual life of their era, one carefully crafted word at a time. Think about the most exquisite medieval tapestries, those vast, woven narratives like the famous Bayeux tapestry. They weren't created from a single, uniform thread, but from countless different colors and textures, each strand carefully selected and intertwined to form a complex and enduring picture. This wasn't just a craft, it was a sophisticated language of visual storytelling. In a very real sense, this is exactly how the intellectual labor of medieval women operated. Their approach to knowledge wasn't about isolating facts into separate disciplines, but about weaving together disparate threads, from ancient philosophy to local folklore, from spiritual revelation to hands-on healing, into a cohesive and usable understanding of the world. The tapestry is the perfect metaphor for their work because it embodies the very principles that defined it: integration, collaboration, patience, and a profound connection to the physical and the practical. This integrative impulse can be seen everywhere in their work. Take Hildegard of Bingen, for instance. she would never have seen a contradiction between writing a soaring piece of sacred music about the heavenly harmonies and composing a detailed medical text explaining the healing properties of a common garden plant. For her, the divine order was reflected in the natural world, and understanding one meant understanding the other. The music, the medicine, the theology, they were all different colored threads in the same grand tapestry of creation. Similarly, the women of the Salerno school seamlessly wove together the theoretical threads of Greek humoral theory, passed down through Arabic texts, with the practical, empirical threads of local Italian herbalism they learned from their mothers and grandmothers. A remedy was judged not by its prestige but by its efficacy and the finished product. The health of the patient was the beautiful, complex pattern that emerged from this blend of global and local knowledge. Furthermore, just as a massive tapestry was never the work of a single weaver but a collaborative effort of many hands guided by a master designer, so too was the building of knowledge. The creation of a manuscript like Herod of Landsberg's Hortus Deliciarum was a monumental group project. One nun might be a skilled Latinist transcribing the text. Another might be a gifted artist translating those complex ideas into vivid imagery. The abbess herself provided the overall design, the intellectual blueprint that gave the entire project its shape and purpose. Each contributor brought her own specialized thread to the loom, and the final masterpiece was a testament to their collective effort. This collaborative model stood in stark contrast to the later university model that often prized individual genius and competitive debate. The knowledge these women produced was inherently communal, designed to educate and uplift an entire community rather than to advance a single career. The metaphor also speaks to the patient, embodied nature of their work. Weaving a tapestry is a slow, meticulous process that requires immense physical engagement with the materials, the feel of the wool, the tension of the loom, the rhythm of the shuttle. This wasn't abstract, detached theorizing. The knowledge these women curated and created was similarly embodied. A nun illuminating a manuscript didn't just think about color. She ground lapis lazuli into vivid blue pigment with her own hands. A healer compounding a medicine would smell the herbs, feel their texture, and observe their effects on the human body. Their intellect was not separate from their physical labor, it was expressed through it. The rhythmic, almost meditative work of weaving, sewing, or scribing provided a space for contemplation, for turning over an idea in the mind while the hands were busy. The knowledge they produced was therefore deeply grounded, tested against the reality of daily experience and the limitations of the physical world. Ultimately, these tapestries of knowledge were designed, like their textile counterparts, to tell a story and to convey meaning that was too complex for words alone. An illuminated manuscript used imagery to summarize a theological argument. A compiled book of remedies told the story of a community's health over generations. The correspondence between scholars wove a narrative of intellectual friendship and shared discovery across continents. The patterns they created, whether in thread, in text, or in thought, were meant to be read, interpreted, and learned from. They understood that truth is rarely a single, stark thread, but a rich, interwoven narrative. By embracing this tapestry method of thinking, medieval women created a form of knowledge that was resilient, adaptable, and deeply human, reflecting the beautiful, complicated, and interconnected world they sought to understand. Yet for every story of a woman's intellectual triumph that has survived, we must remember there were countless others whose potential was systematically stifled by the formidable constraints of their time. The path to knowledge for a medieval woman was not an open road but a narrow, obstacle-strewn path, and understanding these barriers is essential to truly appreciate the scale of their achievements. The most fundamental hurdle was a social and legal landscape designed to confine women to narrowly defined roles. The prevailing philosophy, heavily influenced by both classical antiquity and church doctrine, often portrayed women as intellectually inferior, emotionally unstable, and morally susceptible. Figures like Aristotle had argued that women were essentially misbegotten males, a flawed version of humanity, and while medieval thinkers didn't always embrace this extreme view, a general climate of suspicion toward female intellect persisted. This wasn't just abstract prejudice, it had very practical consequences. Formal education, the kind that led to careers in law, medicine, or the upper echelons of the church, was almost exclusively a male privilege. The university gates, when they began to open in the 12th and 13th centuries, were firmly closed to women, barring them from the degrees and credentials that granted intellectual authority in the emerging professional class. This systemic exclusion forced women into a constant state of intellectual justification. A man could claim authority by citing his university education. A woman had to root her authority in something else, something often deemed more acceptable by the patriarchal society. For many, this meant framing their work within a context of divine inspiration. A visionary like Hildegard of Bingen didn't present her massive scientific and theological works as the product of her own brilliant mind, but as revelations directly from God, a strategy that allowed her to bypass the usual channels of scholarly credibility. She was not a scholar, she was a vessel, a mere mouthpiece for the living light. This was a brilliant, if deeply frustrating, workaround. It gave her a platform, but it also meant her immense personal intellect was often downplayed in favor of a supernatural explanation. Other women turned to the language of humility and devotion, presenting their scholarly work as an act of pious service rather than intellectual ambition. They had to constantly navigate a narrow strait between being seen as arrogantly overstepping their bounds or being dismissed as uneducated and irrelevant. Even when they did produce work of staggering originality, they faced the rampant problem of misattribution. Their writings were often published anonymously or, more insidiously, credited to a male author to grant them greater legitimacy. The famous medical texts from Salerno associated with the name Trotula were likely the compiled knowledge of several women, yet for centuries, debates raged among scholars about whether Trotula was even a real woman or just a convenient pseudonym for a male writer, effectively erasing female contributors from their own work. For women who dared to venture into fields considered especially male, like theology or natural philosophy, the risks were even higher. The church held a monopoly on higher learning for much of the period, and while it provided a haven for some women in convents, it could also be a source of oppressive scrutiny. A nun quietly copying scripture was praised for her piety, but a woman offering her own interpretations of that scripture could be accused of heresy. The tragic case of Marguerite Porete stands as a stark warning. This Beguine, a member of a lay religious movement for women, wrote a daring mystical book called The Mirror of Simple Souls, which explored a direct, intimate relationship with the divine that threatened to bypass the institutional authority of the Church. For her refusal to recant her ideas, she was burned at the stake in Paris in 1310. Her execution sent a chilling message about the dangers of female theological independence. This climate of fear meant that many women thinkers had to be exceptionally careful, couching radical ideas in conventional language or sharing their most controversial thoughts only within trusted private circles. Despite this gauntlet of limitations, the genius of these women lay in their incredible resourcefulness in turning constraints into opportunities. Since they were barred from the official seats of learning, they created their own parallel institutions. The convent became their university, The noble court became their research institute. The household became their classroom. They leveraged the only forms of power society readily granted them religious piety, noble status, or domestic responsibility, and used them as levers to pry open doors to the life of the mind. A queen could not enroll at a university, but she could commission translations of Arabic scientific texts and gather scholars at her court to discuss them. A middle-class woman might be denied formal medical training, but she could become an expert empiricist, developing a vast knowledge of herbal remedies through hands-on practice and oral tradition, becoming the de facto doctor for her entire community. They became masters of the informal network, using letters, personal relationships, and the circulation of manuscripts to create a shadow republic of letters that operated alongside, and often in advance of, the formal male-dominated world. Their story is not one of passive victims overcome by obstacles, but of active, cunning, and courageous agents who constantly probe the boundaries of the possible, finding cracks in the wall of prejudice and patiently widening them into doorways for themselves and for those who would follow. Their accomplishments seem even more brilliant not in spite of the barriers they faced, but because of them, a testament to an unyielding hunger for understanding that no constraint could ever fully extinguish. Now imagine a world where every single book is a unique, handmade object, a treasure so rare and valuable that its journey from one reader to another could take years, even decades. This was the reality of manuscript culture, a slow-moving but incredibly powerful system for sharing ideas long before the printing press promised instant replication. Without the ability to mass-produce texts, the circulation of knowledge became an intimate, human-scale endeavor, a delicate chain of trust and craftsmanship where women were often the critical links. A groundbreaking idea couldn't simply be published. It had to be personally recommended, physically carried, meticulously copied, and carefully interpreted, each step offering an opportunity for a curious and capable woman to leave her mark on the intellectual record. The pathways these manuscripts traveled were the very arteries of medieval life. They didn't move in random patterns but followed well-established routes of human movement. A merchant caravan heading from Italy to Flanders might carry not just spices and silk, but a precious copy of a newly translated Arabic medical text, tucked safely in a trader's luggage, perhaps commissioned by a noblewoman patron eager to expand her library. Pilgrims walking the road to Santiago de Compostela or Rome often carried devotional books for their journey, and in the crowded hostels and monasteries along the way, they might share them or even leave them behind as gifts, inadvertently seeding new ideas in distant communities. Most formally, diplomatic envoys between royal courts routinely exchanged luxurious, beautifully illuminated manuscripts as gifts of state, a practice that blended cultural diplomacy with intellectual exchange. A queen receiving such a gift from a foreign ruler wasn't just acquiring a beautiful object, she was gaining access to a new world of thought, which her court scholars and scribes could then study, copy, and integrate into their own understanding. Within this ecosystem, women played multiple essential roles. As patrons, they used their wealth to actively drive the production and circulation of knowledge. A powerful abbess or noblewoman would commission a copy of a specific text she desired, directly funding the labor of scribes and illuminators and effectively determining which works were worth preserving and disseminating. Her choice could rescue an obscure text from oblivion or introduce a controversial new idea to a wider audience. Then, as scribes, particularly within convents, women were the engines of production. Their daily labor in the scriptorium, the careful, aching work of transcription, was what physically replicated knowledge. Each new copy was a potential node for further distribution, One book in a convent library in Germany could be the source for 5 new copies, which might then travel to other houses, slowly creating a network of shared texts across a region. Finally, as readers, women were active participants, not passive consumers. They didn't just receive ideas, they interrogated them. This active readership is vividly revealed in the margins of surviving manuscripts. These margins are not blank spaces, they are bustling with conversation across time. We find notes written in a neat, practiced hand, a nun correcting a grammatical error in the text she's copying, or a noblewoman adding a clarifying note in her own vernacular language next to a complex Latin term. Sometimes these annotations are deeply personal, like a prayer written beside a particularly moving passage of scripture. In other cases, they are fiercely critical, with a reader drawing a pointing hand, called a manicule, to highlight a passage she disagrees with, scribbling false or question this in the margin. These annotations show us that reading was a dialogue. A woman was not just absorbing authority, she was questioning it, arguing with it, and making it her own. She might even add a recipe for a medicine that worked better than the one described in the text, or sketch a diagram to explain a difficult concept, thus actively contributing to and improving the knowledge she was receiving. This slow, deliberate, and highly personal mode of circulation had a surprising advantage over our modern, rapid-fire exchange of information. Because the process was so labor-intensive and slow, it naturally allowed for deep adaptation and reinterpretation. A text copied in a French convent might be subtly altered by the scribe to better fit her community's specific devotional practices. A medical manual from the Mediterranean, when copied in a cold English abbey, might have its herbal remedies adjusted to use locally available plants. Each act of copying was also an act of interpretation. The scribe had to understand the text to reproduce it accurately, and the illuminator had to interpret its meaning to create appropriate images. This meant that ideas were not fossilized. They were constantly being translated, not just between languages, but between cultural contexts. A single idea could evolve as it traveled, being enriched by each new community that engaged with it, creating a rich, multifaceted intellectual tradition that was constantly being refined and reimagined by the very hands and minds through which it passed. Long before the first vellum page was ever inscribed, knowledge lived in the human voice, carried on the breath from one generation to the next in an unbroken chain of memory and meaning. This was the world of oral tradition, a vast and vibrant library of sound that existed in the very air people breathed, and its most dedicated and skillful librarians were so often women. In the flickering light of a hearth fire or within the quiet walls of a convent dormitory, they became the guardians of a different kind of text, one woven from stories, songs, and spoken wisdom. This was not a lesser form of knowledge, but a parallel and equally sophisticated system for making sense of the world, one that operated by its own powerful rules and served a purpose that written texts alone could never fulfill. Think of a mother soothing a restless child not with a written lullaby, but with a song her own grandmother had sung to her, a melody that contained within it the comforting rhythms of a shared past. Or picture an elderly village wise woman, her hands stained from the herbs she gathers, explaining the properties of each plant to a young apprentice not from a book, but through a story, a tale about how this particular leaf was first discovered by a saint lost in the woods, or how that root should only be harvested under a waning moon. In these everyday moments, women were performing a kind of intellectual alchemy, transforming abstract facts into memorable narratives. A simple list of medical instructions is easily forgotten, but a story about a hero who saved a village from plague using a specific combination of herbs. That story, with its drama and emotional weight, would be remembered, retold, and its practical knowledge preserved intact for centuries. The narrative itself became the filing system for vital information, ensuring that crucial lessons about health, ethics, and survival were not just learned, but deeply embedded in the cultural memory. This oral tradition was brilliantly adaptable in a way that a fixed, written text could never be. A manuscript once copied was largely static. A story, however, was a living thing. A skilled narrator could tailor a familiar tale to address a specific situation, perhaps emphasizing a particular moral lesson for a child who had been dishonest, or adjusting a detail about a healing technique to incorporate a newly discovered local plant. This flexibility made oral knowledge incredibly resilient and responsive to changing circumstances. It was a crowdsourced, continuously edited repository of collective wisdom, with women as its primary editors and curators. They could update the data without needing a scribe or a new copy of a book. They simply refined the story in the telling, ensuring the knowledge it contained remained relevant and effective. For the vast majority of the medieval population, those who could not access the rarefied world of Latin texts or afford costly manuscripts, this oral network was their primary, and often only, source of education. Through the songs sung while weaving at the loom, the stories told during the long winter nights, and the proverbs repeated in the course of daily work, people absorbed a complete worldview. They learned the history of their community, the boundaries of acceptable behavior, the complexities of their faith through the lives of saints and martyrs, and the practical science of agriculture, weather patterns, and human health. This was a democratized form of learning, accessible to all regardless of literacy or social status, and it was overwhelmingly facilitated by the voices of women. Their role ensured that knowledge was not the sole property of a cloistered elite, but was a shared community resource, maintained and distributed by its most constant members. The power of this spoken word library is perhaps most beautifully illustrated in the world of music, particularly in the creative output of women like Hildegard of Bingen. While she wrote her compositions down, their true life was in their performance. Her soaring, ethereal chants were meant to be sung, to be experienced physically and communally. The nuns who learned and performed these works were not just reading notes on a page. They were embodying a theological idea, their unified voices becoming a living metaphor for divine harmony and order. The knowledge contained in that music about the nature of joy, the structure of the cosmos, the yearning of the soul for God, was transmitted through the act of singing together, passed from older nuns to novices through careful listening and repetition, a perfect fusion of oral and written tradition that engaged both the mind and the spirit. This enduring legacy reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge is not a monolithic journey from ignorance to enlightenment, but a rich tapestry woven from many different threads. The written word offered permanence and the ability to transmit complex ideas across great distances, but the spoken word offered adaptability, emotional resonance, and universal accessibility. Women, operating masterfully in both realms, understood that the deepest truths often need a story to give them meaning, a song to make them memorable, and a human voice to keep them alive. They ensured that the flame of wisdom was not locked away in a lantern of parchment, but was carried like a torch, passed from hand to hand and from mouth to ear, illuminating the path for everyone. This seamless blending of disciplines wasn't just a personal preference for these women. It was a reflection of a fundamentally different way of understanding the universe itself. The medieval world, you often drew no sharp distinction between the spiritual and the physical, seeing the natural world as a vast book written by God, where every herb, star, and musical harmony revealed a deeper divine truth. For a thinker like Hildegard of Bingen, studying the properties of a plant wasn't just botany, it was a form of theological inquiry. The same creative force that designed the human body also inspired the sacred scriptures, so to understand one was to better comprehend the other. Her medical text, Physica, and her theological visions in Civias were two sides of the same coin, two different languages describing a single, interconnected reality. This holistic perspective meant that knowledge couldn't be neatly filed away into separate cabinets labeled science, art, or religion. Instead, it was a living, breathing whole, and to engage with it required a mind willing to dance across these artificial borders. This integrative approach became a powerful engine for innovation, precisely because it allowed insights from one domain to shed light on stubborn problems in another. Consider the practice of medicine as it was understood by the women of Salerno. Their healing arts were a rich tapestry woven from threads of ancient Greek theory, observed herbal lore, and an understanding of the body's rhythms that came from their own lived experience. A concept from music theory about harmony and balance could directly inform a diagnosis, leading to a treatment aimed at restoring the body's own natural equilibrium. Similarly, the intricate process of illuminating a manuscript was not merely decorative. It was a deeply intellectual act that required the artist to understand complex theological concepts to represent them visually. The illuminator needed to grasp the significance of a biblical parable to distill its essence into a single, powerful image that could teach the lesson more effectively than paragraphs of text. This cross-pollination of ideas, where a musical principle becomes a medical tool or an artistic skill becomes a pedagogical strategy, is where some of the most creative problem-solving occurred. Furthermore, this interdisciplinary knowledge was profoundly embodied and experiential. It wasn't developed in isolated laboratories or quiet libraries alone. It was forged in the dirt of the garden, at the patient's bedside, and in the collaborative space of the scriptorium. Knowledge was something you did as much as something you knew. A nun compounding a healing ointment was engaging in a form of practical chemistry, feeling the texture of the herbs, observing their reactions when mixed, and learning through her senses. Hildegard's compositions were meant to be sung, to be felt in the vibration of the voice and the resonance of the community singing together, using the body itself as an instrument of both artistic expression and spiritual connection. This hands-on engagement meant that theory was constantly tested against reality. A medical idea wasn't valid because Aristotle said so. It was valid because it produced observable results in a suffering patient. This grounding in practice prevented knowledge from becoming overly abstract and disconnected from the human experience it was meant to serve. The legacy of this integrated thinking challenges the very specialization that defines our modern academic and professional worlds. While our deep dives into narrow fields have yielded incredible advancements, we may have also lost something vital: the ability to see the larger patterns and connections. The medieval women who moved fluidly between medicine, music, theology, and art remind us that the most pressing challenges we face, from climate change to public health, rarely respect the boundaries of a single discipline. They demand the same kind of synthetic, holistic thinking that came so naturally in a 12th century convent or a healer's garden. Their work suggests that true wisdom often lies not in mastering one single thread of knowledge, but in learning how to weave many different threads together into a stronger, more beautiful, and more complete understanding of our world. We often picture the Middle Ages as a time of isolated villages and inward-looking kingdoms, but this couldn't be further from the truth for the flow of ideas. Medieval Europe was in fact a surprisingly connected place, crisscrossed by a web of routes that carried not just spices and silks, but something far more precious: knowledge. And women were absolutely essential travelers and translators on these intellectual highways. They didn't just watch this exchange from the sidelines, they actively participated in it, using the unique opportunities afforded by their social positions to weave local insights into a truly global tapestry of understanding. A noblewoman's marriage, for instance, was rarely just a political alliance. It was a cultural and intellectual transfer. When a princess from Germany was sent to marry a king in Sicily, her dowry wasn't limited to gold and land. She brought with her a trousseau of the mind, beloved books from her home convent, scribes who knew her favorite texts, and the entire intellectual culture of her upbringing. Arriving in a vibrant, multicultural court in Palermo, she would encounter a completely different world of learning, one infused with Arabic mathematics, Greek philosophy, and Jewish medical texts. By sponsoring translators or simply encouraging conversations between scholars from these different traditions, she could act as a catalyst, creating a new fusion of ideas that neither culture could have produced on its own. The movement of pilgrims also served as a powerful engine for this cross-pollination. While often motivated by faith, these journeys were also profound intellectual adventures. A woman undertaking a pilgrimage to Jerusalem or Rome would travel for months, passing through dozens of different regions and cultures. Along the way, she would stay in hospices and monasteries, places that were natural hubs for exchanging news and ideas. She might hear a new way of singing a chant in a French abbey, see a strange medical amulet in a Byzantine market, or learn a novel weaving technique from a fellow traveler. When she returned home, she didn't just bring back a pilgrim's badge. She brought back a head full of new concepts, stories, and practical knowledge that she would then share with her family and community. These personal experiences, gathered over thousands of miles, became a form of living library, a repository of comparative culture and wisdom that was constantly being updated and shared through conversation and demonstration. At the heart of this global exchange were the great translation centers like Toledo in Spain and Palermo in Sicily. In these bustling, multicultural cities, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars worked side by side, often under the patronage of a curious and open-minded ruler or noble patron. While the translators themselves were often men, women were frequently the driving force behind these efforts. A queen or powerful noblewoman, fascinated by the advanced medical or astronomical knowledge of the Arab world, would provide the funding, the space, and the political protection necessary for these painstaking projects to flourish. She might commission the translation of a specific Arabic text on astrology to better understand the heavens, or a medical treatise to improve the health of her court. This patronage was a critical form of intellectual leadership. It determined which texts were deemed valuable enough to translate, thereby shaping the entire course of European thought by deciding which ideas from the wider world would be let in. The translated works that emerged from these centers on everything from algebra and optics to philosophy and pharmacology didn't just gather dust in libraries. They circulated through the networks women helped maintain, reaching convents and courts across the continent and fundamentally altering how Europeans understood their world. This access to diverse knowledge sources directly enriched the contributions women could make. A German nun like Hildegard of Bingen, though she never traveled to Spain, could still be influenced by ideas that originated in the Middle East because those ideas had traveled to her along the networks her sisters helped sustain. Her writings on medicine show a synthesis of local Germanic folk remedies with the more theoretical humoral system that had its roots in ancient Greece and was preserved and expanded by Islamic scholars. An Italian noblewoman could commission an illuminated manuscript that blended the artistic styles of Byzantium with the poetic themes of French Romance, creating a new aesthetic that reflected her own cosmopolitan taste. The global reach of these networks meant that a woman's intellectual world was not limited by the walls of her home or the borders of her kingdom. She could be a local healer using a globally informed practice, a patron fostering a cross-cultural dialogue, or a traveler collecting wisdom from every road she walked. Their story proves that the medieval world was not a collection of isolated silos, but a dynamic and interconnected landscape where knowledge was the most valued currency, and women were among its most savvy and far-traveling merchants. Yet, even within a religious hierarchy that reserved formal teaching roles for men, women discovered profound and powerful ways to engage with the deepest questions of faith, not through academic debate, but through the raw, transformative power of direct experience. This was the realm of the mystic, the visionary, who encountered the divine not in a dusty commentary but in the searing depths of their own soul. Without a single university lecture or official ordination, these women crafted some of the most original and enduring theological works of the entire Middle Ages, building their authority on a foundation of personal revelation and unwavering devotion that could not be easily dismissed. Take Julian of Norwich, an anchoress who lived walled into a small cell attached to a church in 14th century England. During a near-fatal illness, she received a series of 16 intense visions, or showings, which she spent the next 20 years of her life contemplating, praying over, and finally writing down in what became the first known book in English authored by a woman. Her work, Revelations of Divine Love, is a breathtaking exploration of God's nature, but its most revolutionary insight is one of boundless optimism. In a world terrified by plague and preached a doctrine of a wrathful God, Julian presented a radically different vision. From her visions, she concluded that despite all the sin and suffering in the world, ultimately, all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. She described God not as an angry judge, but as a loving mother, using intimate, nurturing imagery to explain Christ's care for humanity. This was theology born not from intellectual argument, but from a sustained, deeply personal encounter with what she understood to be divine love, and its comforting message offered a powerful alternative to the fear-based piety of her time. Across the continent in Italy, Catherine of Siena wielded her mystical experiences not in quiet contemplation, but as a catalyst for direct political and ecclesiastical action. The daughter of a humble dyer with no formal education, she experienced vivid visions from childhood that led her to a life of extreme prayer and service. Her mystical encounters fueled a tireless and very public career. She dictated hundreds of letters to scribes, sending them to everyone from the Pope in Avignon to condottieri leading armies, offering fierce spiritual counsel and blunt political advice. Her mystical theology was one of fiery, practical love. She argued that the path to God was not through withdrawal from the world, but through active service within it, describing the soul's journey to God as a bridge built on the stones of virtue and the blood of Christ. Her most audacious act was personally traveling to Avignon to convince Pope Gregory XI to return the papacy to Rome, a mission she undertook because her visions commanded it. For Catherine, mystical experience was not a retreat from authority. It was the very source of a new kind of authority that allowed an uneducated woman to command the attention of the most powerful man in Christendom. The circulation of these women's works is a testament to their profound impact. Julian's text was carefully copied and preserved by others, likely within religious communities that recognized its value. Catherine's letters were widely disseminated during her lifetime, creating a network of influence that amplified her ideas across Italy and beyond. Their writings entered the stream of Christian thought, influencing later mystics and even church doctrine. They demonstrated that theological insight could come from outside the closed loop of clerical training. Their authority was rooted in the authenticity of their experience, a quality that resonated deeply with a populace hungry for a more personal and accessible spirituality. They became living proof that God's voice could speak through anyone, a woman, a layperson, even an uneducated peasant, and that the most powerful theology often emerges not from a lecture hall, but from the quiet cell of a seeker or the fervent heart of an activist. But this empirical spirit wasn't confined to the infirmary or the herbal garden. It extended its reach to the very heavens above. The same intellectual drive that led a woman to meticulously document the effects of a fever-reducing poultice also compelled her to track the movements of the stars and planets. Without access to the complex astronomical tables being developed in distant universities, these women became keen observers of the night sky from their own convent courtyards and castle windows. Hildegard of Bingen, in her characteristically holistic way, didn't see a separation between the celestial and the terrestrial. In her writings, she describes celestial phenomena like eclipses and comets not as abstract astronomical events, but as part of a divinely ordered cosmos that directly influenced life on Earth, from the weather patterns that affected crop yields to the humors of the human body. Her observations, while framed within her theological worldview, were nonetheless precise and detailed, contributing to a growing body of knowledge about the regularity and predictability of the heavens. This practice of careful, repeated observation, noting the timing of a star's rising, the path of a planet, or the sudden appearance of a long-haired star, a comet, was a fundamental scientific act. It required patience, discipline, and a commitment to recording what was actually seen, laying the essential groundwork for the data collection that would later fuel the scientific revolution. Perhaps the most overlooked arena of female scientific innovation lies in the realm of technology, particularly in the development of tools and techniques for textile production. The entire medieval economy, from peasant households to international trade networks, relied on cloth, and the processes of spinning, weaving, dyeing, and finishing were complex chemical and mechanical endeavors largely managed by women. The transformation of raw, greasy wool into a fine, brightly colored piece of fabric was a months-long process that involved a deep understanding of materials. Women developed and perfected countless technologies in this field. They were the chemical engineers who experimented with mordant substances like alum and iron sulfate that would fix vibrant dyes from madder, woad, and weld onto the fibers, creating the brilliant reds, blues, and yellows seen in medieval tapestries and illuminated manuscripts. They were the mechanical innovators who refined the design of the distaff and spindle for spinning, and later adopted the spinning wheel, dramatically increasing the production of thread. The great horizontal looms used for tapestries were operated by teams of weavers, often women, who had to possess a sophisticated understanding of tension, pattern, and structural integrity to bring a designer's cartoon to life. These technological advancements were not written down in theoretical treatises. They were embedded in the muscle memory of skilled practitioners and passed down through generations of apprentices. This was applied science of the highest order, where a slight adjustment in the pH of a dye bath or the tension on a warp thread was the difference between a masterpiece and a ruined bolt of cloth. What unified these diverse pursuits, from pharmacy to astronomy to textile manufacture, was a profound commitment to utility. The knowledge these women pursued wasn't abstract, it had a purpose. It was meant to heal a sick child, predict the coming of winter, or create a beautiful and durable garment for a family or for the altar. This focus on practical outcomes fostered a uniquely grounded and iterative approach to learning. A hypothesis was tested not in a controlled laboratory but in the real world. If this combination of herbs reduces a fever, it is valid. If this new dyeing technique produces a more color-fast scarlet, it is adopted. Success was measured in tangible results, not in rhetorical victories in scholarly debates. This relentless practicality meant that their scientific contributions were often seamlessly woven into the fabric of daily life, making them invisible as science to later historians who were looking for male authors of Latin texts. But the legacy of this hands-on inquiry is immense. It represents a parallel track in the history of science, one that valued careful observation, experimental trial and error, and the dissemination of useful knowledge through practice and demonstration. Long before Francis Bacon would formally articulate the empirical method, these women were already living it, their hands deep in the soil, their eyes fixed on the stars, and their minds tirelessly working to understand, improve, and master the world around them. Now imagine a world where few could read the complex Latin texts that held the keys to knowledge. How do you make profound ideas accessible to everyone, from a devout nun to a curious noblewoman? The answer lies not in words, but in images in the breathtaking artistry of illuminated manuscripts, where women transformed the page into a vibrant classroom of color and form. These weren't mere decorations, they were a sophisticated visual language, a form of intellectual bridge building crafted by the skilled hands of illuminators like End and Guda. In an age where visual literacy often surpassed textual literacy, these artists became powerful teachers, translating dense theological arguments and intricate scientific concepts into compelling narratives that could be understood at a glance. A single illuminated page could convey the entire sweep of biblical history, the complex structure of the universe, or the delicate anatomy of the human body, making the invisible visible and the incomprehensible beautifully clear. Consider the practical genius behind this approach. A densely written theological treatise on the nature of the Trinity, filled with abstract Latin terms, would be accessible only to a handful of highly educated clerics. But an illuminator could distill this daunting concept into a powerful visual symbol, perhaps 3 interconnected figures within a single circle of light, or a single face with 3 distinct expressions. This image could then be meditated upon, discussed, and understood by a much wider audience, sparking contemplation and discussion without requiring fluency in academic language. Similarly, a medical text describing the flow of humors in the body could be brought to life with a detailed diagram of a wound man or a zodiac man, illustrating which parts of the body were governed by which planets and which herbs could be used for treatment. This visual shorthand wasn't a simplification. It was a different and often more effective mode of communication. It allowed complex systems of thought to be grasped intuitively, engaging the heart and the imagination alongside the intellect in a way that pure text alone often could not. The work of these female illuminators was an act of profound interpretation, not just imitation. When a scribe like Guda, working in 12th century Germany, inserted a small self-portrait into the decorative initial of a manuscript, she was doing something radical. Holding a scroll that boldly declares Guda, sinner, wrote and painted this book, she wasn't just signing her work, she was asserting her intellectual ownership and her role as a conscious interpreter of the sacred text she was illustrating. Her artistry shaped how future generations would visualize and therefore understand these stories. Another brilliant example is the Spanish illuminator End, who in the 10th century was described in a colophon as a painter and servant of God, working alongside a monk named Immaterius on the magnificent Beatus of Giana commentary on the Apocalypse. Her vibrant, almost surreal illustrations of the end times didn't just accompany the text. They actively interpreted its terrifying visions, guiding the viewer's emotional and spiritual response to concepts of divine judgment and salvation. Through choices in color, composition, and symbolism, these women were effectively writing a parallel commentary in paint, offering their own insights and emphasizing certain aspects of the doctrine over others. This visual pedagogy extended beyond religious texts into the realms of science and natural philosophy. Herbal manuscripts, essential for the practice of medicine in convents and households, relied on accurate and detailed illustrations of plants for their utility. A woman illuminator painting these images needed a keen observational eye, often working from real specimens to capture the specific shape of a leaf, the arrangement of petals, or the color of a berry. A mistake in the illustration could lead to a fatal error in identification, so her artistic skill was directly tied to the healing arts. These detailed, naturalistic paintings transformed the book into a practical field guide, allowing a healer to confidently identify and use the plants described. In this way, the artistic endeavor was inseparable from the scientific one. The pursuit of beauty served the pursuit of truth and the practical goal of alleviating suffering. The illuminator's studio was, in its own right, a laboratory of observation and representation. The legacy of these artists challenges our modern distinctions between art and science, between beauty and utility. They operated in a world where these concepts were seamlessly intertwined, each enriching the other. The gold leaf applied to a halo wasn't just for show. It was a visual metaphor for divine light and the unutterable glory of heaven. The intricate geometric patterns framing a page weren't mere decoration. They reflected a belief in the mathematical order underlying God's creation. Through their artistry, women like End and Guda demonstrated that the path to knowledge could be paved with beauty, and that the most profound truths often required a visual language to be fully grasped. They remind us that understanding is a multi-sensory experience, and that sometimes the most powerful ideas are those we can see with our own eyes. But this pursuit of knowledge was never just a neutral act of collecting facts. In the hands of women, it could become a subtle, powerful, and sometimes dangerous form of resistance. Operating within a system that often denied their right to independent thought, their very engagement in intellectual life was a quiet challenge to the established order. When a nun like Hildegard of Bingen interpreted scripture through her own visionary experiences, she was, in effect, creating a new channel of divine authority that bypassed the male clerical hierarchy. Her writings, while carefully framed as obedience to God's command, presented a theological worldview that was uniquely her own, offering an alternative to the sanctioned teachings of the schools. Similarly, the women healers of Salerno, by trusting their own empirical observations over the received wisdom of ancient male authorities like Galen, were making a radical statement that a woman's lived experience and hands-on practice could be a more reliable guide to truth than a centuries-old text. This wasn't just medicine, it was a quiet insurrection against the monopoly of traditional knowledge, asserting the value of practical, female-grounded expertise in a world that prized theoretical, male-authored doctrine. The stakes of this intellectual descent could be terrifyingly high, as the tragic story of Marguerite Porreet devastatingly illustrates. A beguine, a member of a lay religious movement for women that valued mystical experience and simple living, Porreet wrote a bold and beautiful book called The Mirror of Simple Souls. In it, she described a path to spiritual perfection so intimate and direct that it ultimately made the institutional church, with its sacraments and hierarchy, seem unnecessary. She wrote of a soul so annihilated in divine love that it was beyond the reach of sin, virtue, or even the need for good works. To the ecclesiastical authorities in early 14th century Paris, this was not inspiring mysticism, it was catastrophic heresy. It undermined the very foundation of their power and control over salvation. Porete was arrested, tried, and given every opportunity to recant her views. Her refusal to do so, her steadfast commitment to the truth of her own spiritual experience, led to her being burned at the stake in the year 1310. Her execution was a stark, brutal warning to any woman who dared to venture into theological territory deemed off-limits by the male guardians of orthodoxy. Her book was publicly burned with her, an attempt to literally erase her ideas from existence. Yet for every Marguerite Porete who faced the ultimate punishment, there were countless other women practicing quieter, more sustainable forms of resistance through their daily intellectual labor. The very act of a noblewoman building a library was a political statement, a declaration that she would curate the ideas available in her sphere of influence. By choosing to commission translations of Arabic scientific texts or to preserve the works of classical poets, she was shaping the intellectual landscape according to her own values, often promoting a more cosmopolitan and inclusive worldview than the Church might have preferred. When an abbess like Hildegard of Landsberg compiled her Hortus Deliciarum, she was creating an entire educational curriculum for her nuns, a complete system of knowledge that existed entirely outside the control of any university or bishop. She was effectively saying, we can educate ourselves, we can determine what is worth knowing. This was a profound assertion of female intellectual autonomy. Even the simple, unglamorous work of the scribe could be an act of quiet defiance. In the margins of manuscripts they copied, we sometimes find their personal annotations. A question mark next to a dubious claim, a correction of a factual error, or a note adding a local remedy that worked better than the one prescribed in the text. These tiny, handwritten interventions are the footprints of a critical mind at work, a reader who was not passively accepting authority but actively engaging with it, questioning it, and on a small scale, correcting it. Through these countless, seemingly insignificant acts, curating a book collection, teaching a child to read, sharing a new idea in a letter, adding a marginal note, women steadily expanded the boundaries of what could be thought and said. They created alternative networks of validation where ideas were judged not by the credentials of the author but by their utility, their beauty, or their resonance with lived experience. This slow, patient work of cultural shifts rarely makes the history books, but it is how change often truly happens, not in a single dramatic confrontation, but through the relentless, everyday pressure of curious minds refusing to be silenced, steadily weaving new possibilities into the very fabric of society. This shift towards institutionalization was not a simple story of progress. The rise of universities like those in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford undoubtedly brought tremendous gains. They created a standardized curriculum, the famous trivium and quadrivium, which ensured a certain baseline of knowledge for all scholars. They developed formal degrees, a system of credentials that could certify expertise and create a professional class of teachers and doctors. Most importantly, they enabled a systematic, cumulative advancement in specific fields like law, theology, and later, natural philosophy. Scholars could now build directly upon the work of their predecessors in a structured way, debating and refining ideas in a dedicated space designed for that very purpose. This was a powerful engine for intellectual progress, creating a stable infrastructure for knowledge that could endure for centuries. Yet for all these gains, this new model came with profound and often overlooked losses. The very act of standardization meant that certain types of knowledge were now deemed legitimate, while others were pushed to the margins. The holistic, integrative approach that had been the hallmark of women like Hildegard of Bingen, where theology, medicine, music, and natural observation were woven into a single tapestry of understanding, now seemed disordered and unscientific next to the newly defined disciplines. The knowledge produced in universities was increasingly abstract, theoretical, and text-based, prized over the practical, embodied, and experience-based knowledge that had flourished in convents, households, and healing practices. The vibrant, relational networks that had connected a German abbess to an Italian court were slowly replaced by a more rigid hierarchy of masters and students within a single institution. The most immediate and devastating impact was the almost total exclusion of women from this new world of formal learning. The university was, from its inception, a male-only corporation, a guild of masters and students that required its members to be clerics, which effectively meant they had to be men. The doors that had been slightly ajar in the informal networks of the previous era, where a woman could lead a convent school, correspond with a pope, or practice medicine based on her results, were now slammed shut and bolted. A brilliant healer in Salerno could no longer easily contribute to a medical discourse that was now happening in Latin within lecture halls from which she was barred. A visionary theologian like Hildegard would have found no platform in the scholastic debates of Paris. Women were not just kept out of the classrooms, they were systematically written out of the intellectual tradition itself. The contributions of the Meulière Salernitany were increasingly attributed to the mythical figure of Trotula or to male authors. The medical compilations that had once circulated under women's names were now absorbed into the anonymous corpus of university texts, their female origins erased. This transition represents a fundamental narrowing of the very definition of who could be a knower and what could count as knowledge. The university model privileged a single, dominant way of learning, competitive debate among men based on authorized texts conducted in Latin and certified by a degree. The quieter, more collaborative and integrative modes of inquiry that had thrived in women's spaces were dismissed as amateurish, intuitive, or even suspicious. The result was a kind of intellectual monoculture. While the universities drove progress in their chosen fields, they also made the world of ideas less diverse, less innovative in its methods, and far less inclusive. We gained depth in specific silos of knowledge, but we lost the connective tissue that had linked those silos together. We gained professional scholars, but we lost the wise women, the patron queens, the abbess scholars, and the healer observers who had sustained learning for centuries. Understanding this great transition is crucial because it forces us to ask what we might still be missing today when we equate education solely with formal accreditation and dismiss knowledge that comes from outside the walls of our most prestigious institutions. And just as those medieval networks thrived outside the walls of emerging universities, we see a remarkably similar phenomenon unfolding today. Our digital age, for all its glossy newness, has become a fertile ground for the exact same kind of informal, relational knowledge sharing that once flowed through convents and correspondence. Think about the last time you learned how to fix something in your home. Did you enroll in a formal course, or did you watch a video made by a passionate hobbyist in their garage, then scroll through the comments to see solutions from a dozen other people who had the same problem? That right there is the modern equivalent of a medieval craft guild, a distributed network of practical wisdom where expertise is earned through doing and sharing, not through a certificate on the wall. These contemporary knowledge communities are everywhere once you start looking. Massive open online courses, or MOOCs, allow a retired engineer in Toronto to learn about ancient Roman history from a professor at Yale, while simultaneously discussing the lectures with a stay-at-home parent in Seoul and a high school student in Nairobi. Grassroots movements like the citizen science platform Zooniverse enable hundreds of thousands of volunteers, many of them women, to collaborate with professional astronomers, classifying galaxies and discovering new planets from the comfort of their own homes, their collective effort achieving what no single institution could. In the world of technology, open-source software projects are the quintessential example. These are complex operating systems and applications built not by a single corporate entity, but by global communities of volunteer programmers who contribute code, debug problems, and write documentation for free, driven by a shared belief in collaboration and open access. It's a digital scriptorium where the finished product belongs to everyone and the scribes are recognized by their usernames and the quality of their contributions. And just as in the Middle Ages, women are absolutely central to these new digital networks, often leading the charge in spaces that value merit and collaboration over traditional credentials. They are the organizers of local makerspaces, teaching soldering and 3D printing to a new generation. They are the driving force behind massive online communities dedicated to everything from historical costuming and precision baking to mutual aid and community organizing, creating vast repositories of shared knowledge that are constantly updated and refined by their members. A woman developing a new knitting pattern and sharing it freely online with detailed instructions is engaging in the same kind of knowledge curation and dissemination as a nun illuminating a manuscript of herbal remedies. The medium has changed from parchment to PDF, but the core human impulse to create, to share, to connect, and to teach remains beautifully, powerfully unchanged. This enduring impulse reveals something fundamental about how we learn and innovate. It shows us that formal institutions, for all their value, are not the only, or even the most natural, way knowledge is built. The real engine of progress has always been this messy, vibrant, and deeply human desire to connect with others who share our curiosity. It thrives on diversity of thought, on the personal relationships that build trust, and on the freedom to experiment without fear of failure. The medieval women who built their networks of learning understood this intuitively. They knew that the pursuit of understanding is a collective endeavor, and that the most powerful ideas are often those that are freely given, not sold. Seeing their legacy reflected in our own digital world reminds us that no matter how advanced our technology becomes, the most crucial element in any knowledge network will always be the human heart and mind, forever reaching out to find another who wonders about the same things. Their stories, woven across continents and centuries, reveal a truth far more profound than simply adding a few forgotten names to the historical record. They challenge the very foundations of how we think about knowledge itself. We are often taught to see intellectual history as a straight line, a grand procession from the classical world to the great universities and into the modern age. But the lives of Hildegard, Herod, Trotula, and countless others show us that this path was never so narrow or exclusive. For centuries, alongside and often before the rise of these formal institutions, there existed a vibrant parallel world of learning, one that was relational, practical, and deeply collaborative. This was a world where wisdom was not locked away in lecture halls but was cultivated in the quiet scriptorium of a convent, debated in the bustling court of a noblewoman, shared in the careful script of a letter, and proven at the bedside of a patient. These women were not exceptions to the rule. They were the architects of their own intellectual systems, building a resilient and adaptable network that kept the flame of inquiry alive. This legacy forces us to ask urgent questions about our own time. What counts as real education today? Is it only the degrees conferred by prestigious institutions, or does it also include the skills shared in a community workshop, the open source code developed by a global collective, the patient knowledge of a gardener, or the wisdom exchanged in an online forum. The medieval women we've met remind us that expertise wears many faces and speaks in many voices. They compel us to look beyond formal credentials and recognize the profound intellectual labor that happens everywhere, in homes, in communities, and in the spaces between established disciplines. They ask us to value the integrator who connects different fields just as much as the specialist who masters one, and to see the curator who shares knowledge as essential as the genius who creates it. Ultimately, their greatest gift to us is a renewed sense of possibility. They demonstrate that the hunger to understand our world is a universal human impulse that will always find a way to express itself, regardless of the obstacles. When doors were closed to them, they built new rooms. When their voices were dismissed, they found other ways to speak, through art, through healing, through the quiet power of a shared manuscript. They teach us that the most enduring knowledge networks are not built of stone and mortar, but of trust, curiosity, and a shared commitment to lifting each other up. As we navigate our own rapidly changing world of information, their example is a powerful guide. It inspires us to seek out diverse voices, to create inclusive spaces for learning, and to never underestimate the power of a single curious mind connected to others to change the world. Thank you for joining this exploration into a hidden chapter of our intellectual heritage. If these stories resonated with you, please share this video with someone else who might find them inspiring, and let us know your thoughts in the comments.